It's quiet now. Wherever you are, you're likely far from snowdrifts and icy winds, perhaps curled beneath a blanket, the soft hum of night surrounding you, and the warmth of a lamp or a screen casting a dim glow across the room. But imagine, for a moment, that this warmth is rare, that the cold isn't something seasonal, it's constant. Imagine a world not just touched by winter, but ruled by it. Long ago, so long that even the oldest stories forget, our ancestors looked into a gray sky and saw no end to the ice. They lived in the shadows of glaciers taller than mountains, walked across lands that no longer exist, and raised their children beneath the howl of wind that never truly stopped. They didn't have central heating or synthetic coats. There were no insulated boots or emergency rations, no weather alerts or glowing fireplaces made by the flick of a switch. There were only the skills of their hands, the warmth of their breath, and the resilience of their spirits, and still, they endured. Tonight, as you settle in and rest, we're going to drift back to that frozen world, to a time when survival was an art, and every moment of warmth was a quiet triumph. We'll explore not just what it looked like to live during the Ice Age, but what it felt like, how it shaped the minds, beliefs, and daily lives of those who faced the cold and whispered stories into the firelight. We'll trace the footprints left in frozen soil, uncover the flint tools shaped by tired fingers, and listen for the soft echoes of language forming in dark caves and snowy forests. This isn't just a tale of suffering. It's a story of invention, of music, of myth, of mothers keeping embers alive while the world outside howled with wind and teeth. And all the while, somehow, our ancestors laughed, loved, painted, and planned. They adapted in ways we still benefit from today. Their struggles were enormous, but so too was their imagination. So if you're ready, let your mind slow down. Let the tension ease from your shoulders. The world outside may be noisy, but here with me, it will be soft and quiet. Together, we'll wander backward, thousands of years. Step by step, we'll visit places no longer on the map, hear voices lost to time, and maybe, just maybe, understand something deeper about what it means to be human. Before we begin, take a moment, if you'd like, to gently tap the like button. Subscribe if you find these quiet journeys comforting, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us, across time zones and across stories. Now breathe in, the snow is falling. Let's go back to when the world was ice. Somewhere, deep in what we now call France, about 20,000 years ago, a small group of humans huddled close inside a limestone cave. You wouldn't know the place today. It's buried, hidden beneath layers of soil and time. But once, it was life. Once it was warmth. Outside the cave, the world was pale. The land stretched white and gray, under a sky that never promised spring. A storm was gathering on the horizon again. Bitter, howling, indifferent. The wind scraped at the cliff edges like claws. Trees were twisted and bare. The snow had long buried any sign of trails or paths. And the animals that moved across this world, they were not deer or rabbits. They were giants, mammoths, woolly rhinos, cats with teeth like daggers. Life was short, and the cold was eternal. But inside that cave, something flickered. A low fire, fed slowly, carefully, as if every ember were sacred. It hissed quietly beneath a spit of bone and glowing coal. The cave's walls glowed amber, shadows dancing and stretching in ancient rhythm. A woman knelt by the fire. Her hands were wrapped in fur, fingers cracked but precise. In her lap sat a child, maybe 6 or 7 winters old. The child held something small, a piece of bone, carved carefully into the shape of a bird, a toy, maybe, a charm. It had been passed down, no doubt, from another child before him, maybe even 2 or 3 generations back. Objects like this were rare, precious, and one day, that carving would be buried, covered by ash, by soil, by ice, forgotten. Until thousands of years later, someone would find it, still smoothed by fingers long gone, still shaped by survival. A whisper from a world colder than ours, What's remarkable isn't that humans survived the Ice Age. It's how they did it, how they loved and learned and made meaning, even when the world outside their shelter tried every day to erase them, how they kept going, even when there was almost nothing left to hold on to but one another. They didn't survive by luck alone. They survived with stories, with cleverness, with a kind of stubborn grace that still lingers in us now. Imagine the long nights, no calendars, no clocks, just hunger and sky and the rhythmic crack of freezing wood. And still, they found ways to paint, to carve, to sing. In some ways, the Ice Age is still with us, in our dreams of firelight, in our fear of being alone, in the deep comfort we find in a warm room, a shared meal, or a softly spoken story before bed. So tonight, let's follow the path back to them. Let's walk along the frozen ridges of memory, where ancient footsteps are barely visible beneath the ice. Let's see what they saw, feel what they felt, and maybe understand, just a little more, how we came to be who we are. We are not the beginning, we are the continuation. And it all started in the cold. It didn't arrive like a hammer blow. Not all at once, not overnight. The Ice Age crept in like a quiet stranger, slowly drawing the curtain closed on warmth and light. A slight cooling here, a shortened summer there. It began with a whisper, not a roar. Tens of thousands of years ago, the Earth tilted just enough to shift everything. Just a degree of difference, but it was enough to change the way sunlight touched the northern hemisphere. That tilt, combined with subtle changes in our orbit around the sun, set a vast chain of events into motion. Ice began to accumulate where it had once melted. Glaciers expanded, pushing downward across continents like slow white juggernauts. And year after year, the snow came earlier, melted later, and then not at all. Across Europe, Asia, and North America, the landscape transformed. Forests retreated, grasslands withered, and from the north, towering walls of ice advanced with glacial patience. Hundreds of feet thick, these were not snowdrifts or frost. These were ancient, grinding beasts of frozen time, carving valleys, splitting mountains, and remaking entire ecosystems as they pressed forward. What we call the last glacial maximum, the coldest and most widespread phase of the Ice Age, reached its peak around 20,000 years ago. By then, the world was utterly transformed. Sea levels had dropped by over 400 feet. You could have walked from what we now call Siberia to Alaska, across a dry plain known as Beringia. Britain was not an island, but a peninsula of the European mainland. Australia and New Guinea were a single landmass, connected by shallow seafloor made bare. The earth was quieter then. Not silent, but muffled beneath the weight of ice and the absence of birdsong. The air was drier, the wind sharper, the horizon whiter. Humans fragile, hairless, fire-dependent humans were scattered in small bands, hugging the warmer edges of the world. They followed herds. They camped near rivers that had not yet frozen solid. They ducked into caves and low-built huts, wrapped themselves in animal hide, and huddled close to their fires. But even they didn't know how long it would last. Generations came and went, and still the cold held. A child could grow old and die never having seen a spring bloom, never having heard thunder without snow, because never having walked barefoot on warm earth. The Ice Age didn't just shape the world, it shaped us. Our bodies adapted, stockier builds to conserve heat, longer noses to warm incoming air. Our minds adapted, crafting tools, learning patience, remembering trails, inventing rituals. Our communities adapted, trusting in one another, in fire, in ancestors, in the stories that helped them survive. They may not have known they were in an ice age, but they knew they were in a world that tested them every day. And so they met it, not with defiance, but with quiet persistence. Every day was a prayer made with breath. Every fire was a victory. Every child born was a reason to keep going. And so they did. Before the roads, before the borders, before the names, the land was open, and it was vast. During the last ice age, the shape of the earth, the literal map of the world, was different. Oceans were lower, locked away in frozen glaciers that spread for miles, and in their place, land emerged. Broad, cold, wind-scoured plains, dry valleys where today there is only sea. What we now call coastlines were once miles inland, and what we now call the deep ocean floor might have been rich hunting ground or quiet shelter. Take a moment to picture it. A world reimagined in white and gray. In Europe, the continent was bound tightly to Asia, its northern lands buried beneath the ice sheet. Places like Germany and Poland were frozen tundra. The British Isles were not islands at all, but merely the northwest edge of a long continuous plain. A dry, icy land called Doggerland once stretched between Britain and the Netherlands, teeming with life, reindeer, aurochs, wolves, and people. That's right. People once walked where there is now only sea. They built camps, they hunted, they gathered, and then slowly the waters rose, and the earth forgot their footprints. To the east, another land bridge, Beringia, connected Siberia to Alaska. It wasn't just a narrow path. At times, it spanned up to 1,000 miles in width, a frozen highway of sorts, though calling it a highway ignores the brutality of the journey. Across that bitter corridor, humans followed herds into what we now call the Americas. Step by step, fire by fire, they moved. These places, Doggerland, Beringia, Sunda, the landmass that connected Southeast Asia, they're gone now. Beneath the sea, but they were once real enough to cradle lives. They were once home, and the terrain they walked, it was not kind. Picture cold steppe, flat, exposed grasslands that baked in summer sun but froze in winter wind. Picture dry riverbeds littered with bones, winds that carried snow sideways, mountains wrapped in silence. Forests, when they existed, were often sparse, gnarled, and stunted by frost. Yet despite this, life thrived in strange, stubborn ways. Great beasts roamed the land, mammoths, tall and woolly, with spiraling tusks and thunder in their step. Mastodons, woolly rhinos, giant ground sloths in the Americas, towering like boulders wrapped in fur. And predators too, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, hyenas the size of horses, and dire wolves that hunted in packs large enough to shape legend. Humans weren't alone, but they were different. They didn't run faster, they weren't stronger, but they remembered, and they noticed, and they adapted. They understood the land not as an enemy, but as something to be read, listened to, learned from. The cracking of a frozen lake, the direction of animal tracks in wind-blown snow, the feel of soft moss beneath the feet, signaling underground warmth or water. To walk across the Ice Age world was to engage in a constant conversation with nature. One mistake could cost everything, but one good decision, one well-timed hunt, one shelter found before nightfall could save a generation. In a way, the land became an old friend. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. Humans knew where the reindeer migrated. They knew which caves held echoes that warned of bears. They knew the brittle songs of ice cracking at dawn. And they knew the places where, even in winter, a spring might trickle beneath the snow. Their survival depended not just on strength, but on observation, memory, and movement. And over time, as they moved, they shaped the land too, with paths worn into tundra, with ash left from fires, with bones buried in ceremonial circles, with cave paintings, handprints, and carvings etched into stone as if to say, "We were here, we walked this way. We made it through." Today, most of those places have vanished under rising seas, overgrown forests, and cities that never knew they were built on ancient memories. But in the dirt beneath our feet, in the soft hush of snow falling in a quiet forest, there's something that lingers, something that remembers. And if we listen closely, we might just hear it too. The cold was not a visitor. It was not a passing storm. It was a tenant of the world, a constant ancient presence that pressed against every breath, every bone, every plan for tomorrow. For the humans who lived during the last ice age, cold was more than temperature. It was an element, a force, a sculptor of daily life. It was the background noise of their existence, humming through the air, seeping into the stones they slept on, and the marrow of their dreams. Imagine waking up each morning with frost on your eyelashes, even though you never left the shelter. Imagine breathing in air so sharp it made your lungs ache. Imagine sleeping curled into another body, not for affection, but for survival. The temperatures during the coldest periods of the Ice Age could plunge well below freezing, far colder than most modern people ever experience. In the depths of glacial winters, vast swaths of the northern hemisphere were locked under permafrost. Entire regions remained frozen year-round, not for a few days or weeks, but for centuries. Wind chill was not a concept, it was simply reality. And so, life adapted or disappeared. Humans, of course, were not made for this climate. We do not have the thick fur of a bear, nor the fat layer of a seal. Our skin, exposed and soft, was not designed to withstand long hours of open snowfields or biting wind. And yet, we endured. They did it through layers. First learned from the animals they hunted: reindeer hide, mammoth fur, bear pelts. Clothing wasn't simply for modesty, it was armor against the elements. Tunics were stitched tightly, layered with grease or marrow fat to help repel moisture. Boots were insulated with moss or dry grass, replaced frequently and dried slowly by firelight. And what firelight it was! To survive the bitter cold, fire had to be constant. Starting it wasn't enough. Keeping it going was everything. Children were taught from a young age how to feed a flame gently, how to move embers from camp to camp. A well-placed stone hearth wasn't just comfort, it was the difference between life and death. The cold affected everything. Tools grew brittle in the chill. Fingers lost dexterity. Hunting became more dangerous, not just because of the prey, but because of the numbness that crept in when one stood too long in the snow. Even the breath could betray you. In extreme cold, exhaling too quickly could freeze the moisture on your lips and cheeks, causing frostbite. Words were spoken softly, closely. Bodies stayed wrapped. Every movement was considered, measured, deliberate. There were no second chances in the cold. Water sources froze over. Gathering became a task of chiseling through ice. Melting snow was possible, yes, but it consumed precious firewood, which in turn meant longer days searching for dry branches or animal dung to burn. And yet humans found ways. They learned to sleep beneath the ground, in shelters built into earth and snow. Caves were insulated with furs and bone frames. Small tents, framed with mammoth tusks and layered with hide, kept warmth in and wind out. They learned how to listen to the weather. A sudden silence in the wind might signal an oncoming storm. The way snow drifted could reveal where it was soft or dangerous. A distant cracking sound might warn of unstable ice beneath a layer of white. The cold also brought a strange kind of beauty. Crystals formed on cave walls in delicate patterns. Morning frost etched delicate ferns onto sleeping skins. The night sky, so clear in winter, was a dome of stars so sharp and close they felt touchable. And there was peace, too. Peace in the stillness, in the shared breath of sleeping bodies, in the small comforts, the feel of fur wrapped around a baby's feet, the taste of fat slowly warming over coals, the glow of embers painting stories on the walls. For Ice Age humans, the cold was not merely endured, it was woven into their songs, their rituals, their memories. It taught them how to be quiet, how to wait, how to cherish what little warmth the world allowed. Today, when we shiver and retreat to our heaters or fireplaces, we are feeling only the faintest echo of what they lived with every single day. And yet, they made it through. Not because the cold eased, but because they learned how to carry fire in their hearts, in their minds, in their hands. When the wind outside howled like wolves through the empty valleys, when the air stung like needles, when the dark lasted too long, it was the hearth that held the world together. Shelter, for Ice Age humans, was not a luxury. It was life itself. The earth, so wide and wild, could not be trusted. The open sky might bring snow without warning. A mountain pass could shift with avalanche. The cold could sneak into bones and never let go. So humans learned to build warmth, both with their hands and with their stories. In some regions, they found caves, natural sanctuaries hidden in cliff faces and rocky outcroppings. These caves became more than mere cover. They were homes, galleries, temples. They offered stone walls against the wind, deep chambers that held heat better than any open plain ever could. Some caves were decorated with ochre handprints and dancing animals drawn in charcoal and ash, a sign that people had not only survived there, but imagined. Elsewhere, where caves were rare, they built. Imagine a small domed shelter made of mammoth bones, tusks arched overhead like a cathedral, layered in thick hides of fur and sealed with clay, mud, or even frozen snow. These structures, discovered in places like Ukraine and Russia, were nothing short of engineering marvels. Some were ringed with fire pits. Others had piles of bones outside, sorted perhaps as offerings or tools to be reused. In colder regions, snow itself became a wall. Packed tightly, it could insulate. When shaped properly, it muffled sound and held in body heat. Tents were made of animal skins, stretched across wooden frames or antlers, pegged down with bone stakes, their interiors lined with grasses or moss. But no matter the material, stone, snow, fur, or earth, it was the hearth at the center that truly defined shelter. A fire, once lit, was rarely allowed to die. Its light gave comfort. Its smoke pushed back pests and spirits. Its heat dried wet clothes and warmed food too tough to chew raw. Keeping that flame alive was a sacred task, sometimes literally. Some archaeological sites show evidence of fire being tended for weeks or months in the same place. People circled around it to sleep. Mothers nursed by it. Elders told stories, staring into the embers as if they held memory itself. And the sound, the gentle crackle of fire, was perhaps one of the few constants in a life of shifting terrain and cold uncertainty. It became music. It became prayer. The hearth also became a kind of emotional center. Around it, life continued. Children played with carved toys made of antler or bone. Adults repaired tools, stitched clothing, sharpened blades. Meals, simple and sacred, were shared communally, often cooked in stone pots or roasted on hot rocks, buried in the coals. At night, when the world darkened, the fire was guarded. One person, often the eldest or the youngest, took the role of keeper, not just of flame, but of memory, of safety, of life. Even the layout of shelters tells us something about the people within them. Sleeping areas were close together, human warmth reinforcing firelight. Work areas were arranged logically, drying racks by the edge of smoke, food storage tucked near cooler stones. Ash was swept, bones were piled. These were not haphazard camps. They were organized, thoughtful, lived in. And then there were the burials. Sometimes, beneath the floors of their shelters, the dead were buried, carefully, tenderly, a child wrapped in fur, an elder buried with beads, or a carved pendant. These shelters were not just temporary. They were homes, and the people within them, even in death, remained part of that home. Hearth and shelter, fire and fur, warmth and memory. That was what stood between the human spirit and the biting cold outside. Today, when we light a candle, when we gather around a stove, when we sit shoulder to shoulder beneath a roof and let the weather rage without, we're echoing something ancient, something built not from luxury, but from need, not from stone, but from hope. A circle of warmth in a cold world, a quiet fire that says, you are not alone, you are safe for now, rest. Hunger, in the Ice Age, was never far. It curled at the edge of every journey. It walked beside each hunter. It whispered beneath every wind-blown night. In a world where warmth was rare and movement cost precious energy, food wasn't just sustenance, it was survival, measured in heartbeats. And yet, in the frozen lands of the Pleistocene, humans found ways to feed themselves. Not always comfortably, not always reliably, but enough to endure. The most obvious source of nourishment was meat, rich in fat, dense with calories, and often the difference between life and death in long winters. But hunting was not a feast. It was a trial, a ritual, a risk. The animals they hunted were enormous. Mammoths, reindeer, bison, horses, aurochs. Their strength was matched only by their awareness. These weren't herds gently grazing behind fences. They were wild, skittish, powerful. One misstep could mean injury. One failed hunt could mean a village gone hungry. To succeed, humans worked together, not in silence, but in rhythm. They tracked footprints left in snow or soft earth. They read the paths carved into frozen hillsides. They knew migration patterns not from books, but from memory passed across generations. Grandfathers teaching grandsons, mothers whispering to daughters where the caribou would return each spring. Some hunting parties used traps, deep pits lined with stakes, carefully hidden beneath snow and brush. Others drove animals toward cliffs or narrow river bends where they could be surrounded. Spears were shaped from flint and tipped with bone. Some were thrown. Others, used up close, required terrifying bravery. There were no guarantees. Even the most skillful hunter might return empty-handed. Sometimes the weather changed. Sometimes the herd turned. Sometimes someone didn't come back. But when they did succeed, when a mammoth was felled, when a bison was brought down, it was a communal victory, a moment of abundance in a world that rarely offered it, and every part of the animal was used. Meat was sliced into strips, dried or smoked over low fires. Organs, rich in nutrients, were cooked first. Bones were cracked open for the marrow inside, a precious source of fat. Hide became clothing. Sinew became thread. Teeth became ornament. And even dung was used as fuel. There was no waste. There could not be. But hunting was not the only path to food. In warmer regions or during short summers, gathering became vital. Humans knew which roots to dig, which berries to avoid, and how to recognize the glint of edible seeds hidden beneath frost. They harvested tubers, chewed wild onions, peeled bark for its inner layer of nutrition. They learned which plants soothed the stomach, which could be ground into powder, which could be boiled into broth. Even insects and grubs were gathered when needed. Protein was protein. Survival doesn't care about taste. Fishing, too, played a quiet role. Ice holes chiseled by hand, nets woven from fibers, hooks carved from bone. The flash of a trout beneath the surface might feed an entire family. And in coastal regions, people foraged for shellfish, crabs, and seabirds. The sea, though colder than any welcome, still offered life. There is one more food that must be spoken of, one often overlooked, but deeply telling. Fat. Yes, fat. Not just from animals, but from the memory of scarcity. Ice Age humans revered fat. They stored it in skin pouches. They boiled bones just to collect it. They traded it. They smeared it on their faces and tools. Fat meant warmth. Fat meant calories. Fat meant life. When they sculpted small figurines, those famous Venus figures with rounded forms and soft lines, it wasn't necessarily beauty they were carving. It was longing. A body full, fed, safe. A body that could survive the cold. And so each day was a decision. Stay near shelter or venture far. Risk exhaustion for the hope of protein. Harvest frost-sweetened berries or chew the bark of a tree. Children learned early which mushrooms could kill and which roots needed soaking to be edible. Food wasn't gathered casually. It was remembered, memorized, honored, and perhaps most telling of all, it was shared. Around the fire, the meal was passed, not hoarded. Even when the catch was small, even when the broth was thin, it was divided, because one person fed meant another could hunt tomorrow. One warm child meant another could carry on the story. To find food in frozen lands required more than tools. It required patience, memory, community, faith, and every bite was a soft defiance against the cold. There was always something watching. In the twilight hours, as the fire cracked low and the wind pressed against the walls of skin and bone, eyes blinked just beyond the light, not always close, not always seen, but known. The Ice Age world was not empty. It breathed with other lives, some gentle, some curious, many dangerous, and at the very edge of human camps, wolves waited. Sometimes they waited with hunger, sometimes with something stranger. Predators were part of the landscape. Humans were not the only hunters, and certainly not the strongest. Saber-toothed cats prowled the shadows. their long teeth more than threat. They were myth in the making. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, moved silently through Europe's grasslands and forests. There were massive hyenas, packs of them, laughing through icy ravines. Bears, great cave bears, claimed shelters and caves as their own, towering over any human who dared cross their path. But wolves were different. They were not the largest, not the fiercest, but they were clever, and they were close. Pack animals, like humans, social, like humans, capable of great loyalty, strategic in the hunt, and quietly observant. Wolves watched from the edges of firelight, eyes glowing, ears flicking, breath steaming in the cold, and perhaps, long before names were given and stories were written, something passed between the two species. Not in speech, not in sudden alliance, but in a slow, cautious study of one another. Humans began to notice that wolves followed the herds too, that they tracked in patterns, that they learned where prey slept, where it fled, where it lingered, and wolves, in turn, saw humans bring down animals far larger than themselves. They saw scraps left behind, bones with marrow, fire. Something frightening at first, but warm, useful, safe. We do not know when the first wolf came close. Only that one did, and then another, and another. Some were likely killed, driven off. Others lingered. Maybe pups were taken, raised among humans, half wild, half trusted. Maybe a wounded wolf was fed and healed. Maybe two young creatures, one human, one canine, curled beside the same fire for warmth, one frozen night. And in that curling, something ancient and irreversible began. Not all wolves became dogs, of course. Not all camps welcomed them, and not all regions followed the same story. But somewhere, over time, certain wolves, smaller, gentler, more social, were drawn closer to human life. They were not tamed immediately. They were not pets. They were companions in waiting, learning our ways as we learned theirs. The earliest domesticated dogs, according to archaeological traces, may date back as far as 15,000 years ago. Their bones lie buried near human graves, sometimes with red ochre sprinkled in ceremonial gesture. Some were buried curled beside children, others with old men, perhaps hunters who had shared years and trails with their silent partners. These early dogs helped humans hunt. They guarded camps. They warmed sleeping bodies. They warned of danger. And perhaps most powerfully of all, they became part of the emotional fabric of survival. Because in the cold, silence can be a heavy weight, and a pair of watchful eyes, a wagging tail, a soft, steady breath in the dark, that could be enough to carry a soul through the long night. But even as wolves and humans began to intertwine, the wilderness was never fully tamed. There were still shadows, still eyes beyond the reach of firelight, still nights when a child wandered too far and was never seen again, still mornings when claw marks on the snow told stories no one dared to repeat aloud. Yet humans did not withdraw. They respected the danger. They made space for it in their songs, their carvings, their dreams. Some believed animals had spirits, souls that watched, judged, guided. To kill without respect was to invite misfortune. To walk through the woods without a whispered offering was to risk becoming prey. Predators were not evil, they were teachers. Boundaries were not prisons, they were pacts. And in this balance, this unspoken arrangement between the hunters of the land, life endured. Today, our pets sleep at the foot of our beds. We light candles instead of fires. We no longer look into the woods and wonder what waits. But in the silence of certain nights, when the wind moves just right, when a dog lifts its head for no reason, we might still feel the presence of those ancient wolves, watching, waiting, guarding the edge. There is a kind of silence that only cold can bring, not the gentle hush of a quiet room, not the pause between words and conversation. No, this silence is heavier, older. It presses in from the edges of the world, from the white blanketed plains and the still dark skies. It hums in the bones and curls into the folds of fur-lined shelters. It is not empty. It listens. In the depths of the last ice age, Silence was a constant companion. The forests were thinner. The birds were fewer. In winter, snow dampened every step, every breath, every falling twig. Even the wind, for all its fury, often came in waves, leaving moments of eerie stillness that stretched across the tundra like a skin. For early humans, these moments were not merely background. They were part of life, part of awareness, part of memory. To live in such a world was to be attuned to the smallest shift, the distant crack of ice, the barely audible call of an animal, the snapping of frost from the trees at dawn. Silence was not peace. It was information. It was presence. It was threat. And sometimes it was comfort. Inside shelters, silence took on another tone. There, it was shared, woven between sleeping bodies, between the sigh of smoke curling toward the ceiling, between the slow crackle of fire and the shallow breathing of children. Words weren't wasted in these spaces. Conversations were low, soft, careful. Many stories were told, not aloud, but with gesture. Hands carving air, eyes widening, shoulders shifting to mimic the arc of a spear, the pace of a hunt, the thrill of a memory. And when words were used, they were chosen. A chant to greet the morning, a name spoken over a grave, a whispered prayer to the spirit of the forest. Silence wasn't an absence. It was a presence, a fullness, a space to feel what could not be said. Imagine now the long nights of an Ice Age winter. No clocks, no glowing screens, no music from another room, just the deep thrum of the fire, the creak of a hide wall shifting in the breeze, the weight of sleep pulling at the limbs. The darkness would arrive early, sometimes by mid-afternoon, and it would stay, long and thick, until the late gray morning returned. In the northern regions, whole months passed with barely a sunrise. Entire families slept in cycles, in layers, resting when they could, waking to tend the flame or stretch aching limbs. Sleep was not something done in 8 neat hours. It was fluid, communal, often segmented. There is evidence, soft and speculative, that humans may have once had 2 sleep phases. A first sleep, then a waking hour in the middle of the night, followed by a second, a time for thinking, or praying, or simply listening to the quiet. In these hours, the silence became sacred, a place where the soul stretched, where dreams took root, where fears visited, and sometimes left without a trace. For children born into this silence, the world may have seemed impossibly vast. There were no crowds, no shouting markets, no droning cities. Their lullabies were the distant howl of wind, the beat of a drum, the gentle retelling of an ancestor's tale. Their games were played with bone figures and pebbles, their laughter quick to fade back into stillness. And for elders, those rare weathered humans who had survived dozens of winters, the silence held memory. They had heard wolves change their patterns. They had seen herds shift course, felt the difference in snowfall from one decade to the next. To them, the quiet wasn't just silence, it was history. They taught others to listen, to hear danger in the sudden stillness of birds, to know the age of ice by the way it cracked, to sense the coming of snow by how distant the trees began to sound. Today, our world is rarely silent. We fill every corner with noise, some chosen, some not. Music, engines, voices, clicks, hums. The stillness that shaped our ancestors feels foreign to us, sometimes even frightening. But in that ancient silence, humans were not lost. They were found. It was in that quiet that they learned how to survive together, how to observe, to adapt, to create, how to dream. The world then moved slowly. So did thought. So did time. And in that slowness, something beautiful was born. So if, tonight, you find yourself in a moment of stillness, a space between breaths, between thoughts, let it come. Let it stretch wide. Let it hum in your chest, like an ancient song. Because long ago, in the cold and the dark, it was that very silence that kept us alive. Their fingers were cold, cracked and calloused, but they remembered. Hands that carved, hands that stitched, hands that held memory in bone and stone. Long before pens, before paper, before anything that could preserve a name or a thought in ink, our ancestors spoke through their tools. A sharp edge, a hollowed shaft, a carefully polished point. These weren't random pieces of rock. They were language, survival, carved in flint. The world of Ice Age humans was a world built by hand. From the moment a child was strong enough to grip a stone, they began learning, not from lessons spoken, but from repetition, observation, muscle memory passed down like sacred ritual. The first tools were simple: hand axes, scrapers, hammers made from rocks carefully selected and struck against one another to split just right. Over time, these tools became more sophisticated, blades so thin and sharp they could slice hide in one pull, points shaped to pierce the thickest mammoth hide, awls to poke holes through leather, tiny chisels to carve bone. These weren't disposable, they were heirlooms. A flint blade might be used for years, resharpened again and again until it was nothing but a nub. Some were buried with their owners, others were left behind in shelters, discovered thousands of years later, still bearing the shape of their maker's hand. There's something deeply human in the way tools were shaped, not just for function, but for form. Some handles were carved with lines, dots, or animals. Spear shafts bore burn marks or beads. Even practical objects were touched by art, proof that beauty mattered, even when survival was fragile. And there was rhythm, too. The sound of napping stone, the tap, tap, tap of one rock against another, echoed across valleys, becoming a familiar heartbeat in ancient camps. Children mimicked it in play. Elders did it slowly, with focus. The younger learned by watching, by doing, by failing. Some tools required more than one person to make. Others, like bows or hafted spears, needed time, patience, and planning. Adhesives were made by heating birch bark into tar. Sinew was dried, twisted, and tied into cords. Feather fletching was carefully balanced. It was work. But more than that, it was tradition. These hands didn't just shape tools. They shaped the world. They knew how to cut trees with stone axes, how to dig trenches with sharpened antlers. They knew which bones were best for fish hooks, which ones snapped too easily. They carried their tools on belts of hide, slung across their backs in woven satchels, hidden in the folds of their garments. Every tool was a decision, every edge, a memory. Every maker, a link in a chain reaching back beyond language. Today, when we see these artifacts behind glass, carefully labeled and lit from above, they may seem simple, but in truth, they represent generations of trial, error, and genius. And the hands that shaped them, they were not so different from ours. Before the loom, before thread, before seams stitched by machine or cotton fields planted wide, there was hide, and there were hands, and there was cold. To survive the Ice Age was to learn the language of warmth, not just from fire, but from what could be wrapped around the body, held tight, layered, softened, shaped, and trusted to hold back the chill of a frozen world. Clothing in the Ice Age was not fashion, it was armor, and it was sacred. Every stitch, every wrap, every layered fold was a strategy against death by exposure. Imagine a child born into a shelter, half buried in snow. The first thing to touch its skin might be a swaddle of soft fur, warmed by a mother's breath. As the child grew, so too did their garments, patched, remade, handed down. Clothing was never wasted, it evolved with its wearer. And unlike today, where fabrics arrive in bolts or are purchased from racks, Ice Age clothing began with the hunt. A reindeer provided food, yes, but it also gave hide for tunics, sinew for thread, bones for needles, antlers for toggles. Each part of the animal had a purpose, and every pelt held potential. Hides were scraped clean of fat and muscle using flint scrapers, then stretched and smoked to preserve them. Some were softened with animal brains, a process that may sound strange now, but worked remarkably well. Others were chewed, quite literally, by the women who prepared them, their teeth gently breaking down the fibers over hours. The skilled hide worker knew the difference between reindeer and fox, between rabbit and wolf. They knew which parts stretched best, which furs shed too easily, which stayed warm even when wet. Clothing was layered, Always. An underlayer of soft, absorbent hide or fur, turned inward. Over that, a thicker layer for insulation. Then another, possibly treated with animal fat to repel moisture. In the coldest regions, even boots had multiple parts. Inner shoes stuffed with dry grasses or moss, and outer boots made from hide, wrapped and tied tight. Sleeves were separate. Hoods could be drawn over the head and tied beneath the chin. Mittens were worn like soft pockets, often shared between sleeping companions to conserve warmth. And around the waist, a belt, not for fashion, but to carry tools, flint knives, fire-starting stones, tiny pouches of dried fat or crushed herbs, always ready, always close. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult garments, often made from the softest furs. Babies were wrapped and tucked against their mothers, skin to skin, within layers of blanket-like robes. And when a garment tore, it was not thrown away. It was patched, mended, reinforced. A hole in a winter tunic could mean frostbite or worse. One of the most remarkable inventions of the time? The needle. Made from bone, ivory, or antler, often small and elegant, with a carved eye for threading sinew or plant fibers. These tools allowed humans to stitch clothing that truly fit, wrapped close to the body, reducing heat loss, allowing movement, and sealing in life. Some Ice Age needles are so finely made, they rival modern sewing tools. Mind High-Ridge-Tum, and they weren't only functional, they were cherished, carried with care, sometimes decorated, sometimes buried with their owners, because to make clothing was to save lives. Clothing wasn't only practical, it became cultural. Some groups wore beads made from shells or carved bones sewn into the hems of their tunics. Others added fringe or dyed sections with natural pigments. Decorative sashes may have held spiritual meaning, or perhaps just pride. Colors were limited: earth tones, deep browns, blacks, whites, the occasional red or ochre, but within those hues was identity. Tribes may have recognized one another by the cut of a sleeve, the trim of a hood, the pattern of beads at the ankle. Even in the cold, beauty mattered, because beauty is not luxury, it is expression. It is the mark of human hands saying, "I was here, I lived, I chose." When we see mannequins in museums dressed in animal hide reconstructions, we might forget the labor behind each piece. But weeks of scraping, the days of smoking, the hours of stitching by firelight, with fingers raw and eyes strained, these were not primitive rags. They were technology, they were art, and they were legacy, because without them, no human could have survived the wind, the frost, the long white sleep of winter. So the next time you zip a coat, pull on socks, or wrap yourself in a blanket, pause for just a moment. Remember those ancient hands, those needle-carving fingers, that first stitched seam, and the quiet triumph it carried. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, where even breath could turn brittle in the air, there was no sound more sacred than the gentle crackle of fire. Not the roar of it, not the blaze of a bonfire, but the steady hum, the soft hiss of flame, licking wood, the patient glow in a pit of coals, whispering warmth against the dark. Fire was not a convenience. It was life made visible. For early humans, mastering fire was not just a milestone. It was a covenant, a pact between the fragile human body and the indifferent forces of nature. Fire offered protection, warmth, cooked food, light, and the means to shape tools. But above all, it offered continuity. Because in a world where everything could change overnight, weather, hunger, danger, fire stayed, and so they kept it. They did not always make it fresh each day. That would be risky, wasteful, too dependent on materials and chance. No, in many cases, fire was carried, preserved like a precious treasure. Small clay bowls filled with glowing embers, hollowed animal horns packed with ash-wrapped coals, bundles of fungus or bark smoldering inside a wrap of leather. Fire was transported gently from place to place, often protected by the youngest or the oldest members of a group. The firekeeper wasn't always the strongest, but they were the most trusted. They knew how to feed it just enough, how to keep the air flowing, how to sense when it needed breath or rest. Sometimes, a child was chosen to sit by the fire, as others slept. Their role wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. But it was essential. To lose the flame in the dead of winter could mean death for all. In some groups, this duty was ritualized, passed down like a sacred lineage. Grandmothers teaching granddaughters, fathers showing sons how to coax life from ember and flint. And when fire was lost, it had to be made again. The process was delicate, laborious, sometimes miraculous. Flint struck against pyrite, sending a spark onto a nest of dry moss or shaved bark. A bow drill, twisted tightly and spun back and forth, creating heat through friction until a wisp of smoke rose, followed by a flicker, a glow, a breath of fire. It could take hours. And fingers numbed by cold, and patience measured in generations, because what you were doing was not just starting a flame. You were summoning life from nothing. Fires were not just heat sources. They were gathering places, in shelters and camps. The hearth was the heart. People circled close. Meals were prepared, tools repaired, stories whispered, shadows danced on walls, carrying echoes of tales older than language. It was here that songs were born, that ancestors were remembered, that silence was shared, and sometimes fire became more. Some sites show multiple hearths, each with purpose, one for cooking, one for light, one for ritual. Ashes were spread, patterns drawn, offerings left in glowing coals, charred bones, burned beads, animal teeth arranged beside embers. These weren't accidents, they were meaning made visible. To lose fire was unthinkable. In the coldest parts of the Ice Age, even a few hours without it could lead to frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. So fire became more than heat. It became a symbol, a memory of the sun, when the sky gave none, a heartbeat, steady and warm, when nothing else remained, a shared soul, flickering across generations. Even today, when we gather by a fireplace or light a candle in the dark, something in us softens. We become quiet, still, as if remembering something. The ancient trust in flame, the way it held back the dark, the way it stayed when everything else froze. So let the fire burn low here in our story. Let it warm your thoughts as we drift forward, because wherever humans went in that long, cold age, they brought the fire with them. They kept it. They passed it on, and it never truly went out. Before alphabets, before writing, before ink traced thoughts into permanence, there was breath and tone and the quiet murmur of meaning shared in the dark. Language, as we know it today, is a river with many tributaries. But long before it became letters and laws, it was sound. It was gesture. It was rhythm and pulse and the need to be understood. And in the flickering glow of firelight, as smoke curled to the roof of a fur-lined shelter, humans began to speak, not just in grunts, not just in cries, but in words. We do not know exactly when spoken language emerged. No archaeologist has unearthed the first sentence, but evidence, drawn from genetics, anthropology, and intuition, suggests that by the height of the last ice age, language was already in bloom. Complex, nuanced, beautiful. These were not the monosyllables of beasts. These were the whispered warnings before a hunt, the soothing hums of lullabies, the sharp instructions of a toolmaker guiding a young apprentice. These were the chants sung to the beat of stone on bone, the questions asked of stars, the names given to rivers and trees and one another, because to name a thing was to know it, to bind it, to carry it in memory. And when the world was covered in snow, memory was all. Inside shelters, words were the stitching between generations. Stories were told in cycles, myths shaped in repetition. One person spoke, another echoed. Children listened, mouths open, eyes wide. The same tale, told 1,000 ways, each time slightly different, each time more meaningful. These weren't just stories of survival, they were origin myths. They explained the stars, the seasons, the sorrow of death, and the joy of fire. They gave shape to chaos. They comforted in the cold. And for those who could not speak, young children, the elderly, those with illness. Gesture became voice. Hands moved with precision. A palm on the chest for me. A tap to the sky for watch. A sweep of the hand for come. The body itself became language. Perhaps, in some places, gesture and voice lived side by side, each carrying different parts of meaning. Perhaps early songs were danced as well as sung. Perhaps silence itself became a word when used with care. Language was not just spoken, it was carried. Across valleys, across migrations, across centuries, a child learned the words of their mother, who had learned them from hers. A tribe developed dialects, inflections, phrases only they used. Sometimes these words were secret, used only in ritual, only in grief, only in joy. And sometimes, when tribes met, through trade or conflict, or shared hunting grounds, words were exchanged like gifts, one word for fire, another for water, a hand pressed to the heart, an eyebrow raised in curiosity. And suddenly, two people could understand one another. Not fully, not easily, but enough. Because the human need to connect was as strong as the need to eat, as deep as the need to sleep, as vital as the fire in the pit. And in that smoke-hazed shelter, language became art. Chants were repeated with rhythm, riddles told to test memory, jokes shared to spark laughter. Yes, even in the Ice Age, surely there was laughter. Words were strung together like beads on a cord, each one chosen, each one understood. And with language came memory, not just of places or people, but of feelings, lessons, warnings, songs. Some words were likely reserved only for sacred moments. Some were never spoken aloud at all. Some may have only been sung in dreams. We will never hear those first voices, never know what the Ice Age word for mother was, or snow, or fear, or hope, but we can imagine them. And perhaps, deep inside us, we still carry echoes of those syllables, in the way we hush our voices before sleep, in the way we hum when afraid, in the way we whisper stories into the dark. Language, in its earliest form, was not only how we survived, it was how we remembered, how we named the fire, how we carried the light. And tonight, in the hush of this story, those voices whisper still. They could have used every moment just to survive, to hunt, to eat, to sow, scrape, boil, and sleep, to stay ahead of the cold, of danger, of hunger that lingered at the edges of every day. And yet, they painted, deep in the earth, beyond where the firelight fades. They climbed into caves. They lit torches made of resin and moss. They pressed their palms to stone, and they left behind images of animals, of movement, of life. Not just scratches or idle marks, but art. The caves of Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, names we give them now, are temples of memory. Their walls are covered in flowing horses, leaping deer, bison in motion, mammoths with curling tusks, lions mid-prowl. Some are drawn with ochre and charcoal, others with manganese and hematite, earth pigments ground fine and mixed with water, spit or animal fat. They used brushes made from fur or hollow bones to spray paint like mist across the surface. The technique was precise, the lines elegant, the compositions deliberate. This was not mere decoration. It was devotion. But why did they paint? No one knows for sure. And perhaps that's the most human part of all. Maybe it was magic, an attempt to summon the hunt, to ensure success by drawing it first. Maybe it was memory, marking a moment when the herd ran close, when the bison turned at the last second, when the mammoth cried out. Maybe it was worship, an offering to unseen spirits, drawn not to be admired, but to be acknowledged. Or maybe it was beauty for beauty's sake, the quiet need to create, to make marks that outlive the hand. Whatever the reason, the result was the same, a living record. Silent, still, yet still breathing. Even now, some of the most haunting images are not animals at all, but handprints, dozens of them, sometimes more, red and black and ghostly white, left like echoes across the stone. Most are negative prints, hands placed against the wall, while pigment was blown around them, like shadows, like the soul saying, "I was here." Some are small, children's hands. Others are marked with missing fingers, twisted joints, or unique patterns. Were these identities? Signatures? Warnings? Prayers? We may never know, but what's clear is this. Those hands reached across time, and tonight, as you close your eyes, they're still reaching. Art extended beyond the cave, too. Carvings were made in bone and ivory. Figures of animals, people, spirits. Some were carried as talismans. Some may have been toys. Others, symbols of fertility or protection. The famous Venus figurines, with their rounded forms and exaggerated features, have been found from France to Russia. Their meaning is debated, but their craftsmanship is undeniable. Tiny etchings, polished stones, incised antlers, each one touched by care, and beads. So many beads, carved from shell, stone, teeth and bone, then strung together into necklaces, bracelets, or sewn into clothing, not for utility, but for expression. Even in the cold, even in hardship, humans longed for beauty. There's something deeply moving about this, that in the harshest of times, beneath glaciers and across frozen plains, humanity still looked inward, still created, still imagined. Art was not a luxury. It was a thread, a way to tie generations together, to hold on to identity, to claim something beyond survival. And now, thousands of years later, we sit quietly in museums, staring at those paintings and carvings. We lean close to the cave wall, guided by artificial lights and glass partitions. And we wonder, who were they? Why did they draw this bison? Why that horse? But perhaps the more important question is, why do we feel something when we see it? Maybe because, in some deep part of ourselves, we still recognize the hand that held the charcoal, the heart that made the line, the soul that reached out through the dark and said simply, "This is who we are." Long before clinics, before medicine, in bottles or tools in polished drawers, there were hands, gentle hands, steady hands, hands that had seen too many winters, too many wounds, and still reached out to help. They were mothers, elders, hunters, midwives. They were not called doctors, not in the way we think of them now, but in the frozen silence of the Ice Age. They were the keepers of healing. Injuries were inevitable. A hunt could go wrong. A fall on icy stone could fracture bone. Infection could bloom from a single scratch. A toothache could become a torment. Birth was dangerous. Fevers could come in the night with no warning and no name. But early humans did not face these things empty-handed. They paid attention to plants, to patterns, to what worked and what did not. And slowly, over time, knowledge took root. From the land came the first medicine. Willow bark was chewed for pain, rich in salicin, the ancient ancestor of aspirin. Certain herbs soothed digestion, others calmed coughing. Some were boiled into bitter teas. Others were pounded into poultices and pressed into wounds. Charcoal, made from fire and patience, was applied to infection. Spider webs, gathered with care, were layered over cuts, perhaps not knowing they were mildly antiseptic, but knowing they helped wounds knit shut. Moss, soft and absorbent, was used to pack injuries or line bandages. Honey, when found, was prized not just as food, but for its healing qualities. And ritual, too, was part of healing. Smoke blown over the body, stones warmed by fire and laid across the chest, songs whispered beside the sick. These may seem strange to us now, but in a world of deep cold and deeper mystery, belief was as important as balm. And then there was the evidence. The bones. Archaeologists have uncovered human remains, 10, 15, even 30,000 years old, that tell remarkable stories. Healed fractures, skulls with clean trepanation holes, where part of the bone was removed, likely to relieve pressure. amputations that show survival well beyond the wound. These were not accidental. These were procedures, done with care, with knowledge. Someone stayed beside the wounded. Someone fed them, kept them warm, cleaned their bandages, listened to their pain. Waited. That is medicine. That is care. Midwives, though invisible in the archaeological record, must have existed. They would have known how to ease labor pains with herbs, how to turn a breech birth, how to wash and wrap a newborn in fur, how to stop bleeding with pressure, or time, or prayer. They likely learned from their mothers, and taught their daughters, and left no trace behind except in the lives that continued. There was also knowledge of death, not to defeat it, but to understand it. People were buried with care. In some graves, red ochre was sprinkled like blood or blessing. Bodies were curled on their sides, as if sleeping. In others, beads were placed beside the head, tools laid beside the hand. A final kindness. It tells us something. That healing wasn't only about the body. It was about dignity, about tending to the soul. So the next time you see a medicine bottle or step into a warm clinic, remember those early hands, working by firelight, chewing herbs, holding fevered skin, whispering over wounds. They didn't have certificates. They didn't have names recorded in books, but they had knowledge and kindness and the quiet determination to ease suffering, even when the world was frozen all around them. She doesn't appear in textbooks. There is no painting of her, no stone inscription with her name. And yet, she was there, at the edge of the fire, inside the shelter, at the center of the story, the woman of the Ice Age. Not a figure carved in marble, not a goddess with outstretched arms, but a human being, cold, tired, determined, and vital. For too long, the story of early humanity was told only in spears and stones, in the chase of the mammoth, the throwing of the hunt. It was told in the shadows of men, brave, wild, enduring. But survival in the Ice Age was not a solo act. It was communal. It was shared. And women were not on the sidelines. They were at the heart of it. She gathered, not in fields, for there were few, but along riverbanks and beneath snow-dusted brush. She knew which roots to dig, which berries to trust, which mosses softened sleeping mats. She stored seeds in woven pouches, chewed bark to ease fever, scraped lichens from stone to boil into broth. She taught, by gesture, by repetition, by calm patience, how to soften hide, how to use sinew as thread, how to hold a newborn so its breath stayed steady through the coldest night, how to braid grasses into cordage strong enough to hang meat. She healed, with poultices, with warmth, with soft chants spoken into smoke, with a hand on the forehead and eyes that watched without panic. She had seen illness before, she had lost people before, and still she returned to care again. She birthed, in pain, in blood, in silence, or in song. Sometimes in shelters, sometimes in the open, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by other women who hummed prayers and wrapped the child in warmth before it even cried. Birth was not only a beginning, it was a risk, a ritual, a raw defiance of a world that often took more than it gave. But each child born was a story that could continue, a hope that pressed on, a new set of hands to learn the old ways. She worked, she made tools, carved bone, tanned hides, until her hands were red and raw. She stitched with needles, fashioned from antler. She watched the weather. She kept the fire alive. Not all women hunted, but some likely did, in smaller game pursuits, in communal hunts, in defense. Because danger didn't pause for gender, and survival didn't ask for permission. And at night, when the cold thickened and the stars blinked above the silent plains, she was the one who told the stories, or perhaps sang them, lullabies low and slow, tales of how the bear got its breath, of how the stars were made, of how once, long ago, there was a woman who outwitted the wind. Archaeology, at last, is beginning to catch up. Burial sites show women buried with tools, spears, blades, and ornamented weapons once assumed to belong only to men. Finger bones suggest repetitive labor. Pelvic bones hint at long lifespans. rare, but real. Some women were buried with infants, others with beads or carvings. Some curled in the earth with red ochre, like a blessing poured over them. They were respected, they were remembered, and in art, we find them too. Figurines carved from ivory or stone, bodies wide, round, full of life. Symbols of fertility, perhaps, or power, or simply beauty, as seen through eyes that valued survival and softness and strength. These figures, found from the Pyrenees to Siberia, are not passive. They are present. They take up space. They remind us women were not just there, they were essential. So when we speak of the Ice Age, let us not speak only of hunts and stones and fire. Let us speak also of her, of the woman crouched by the hearth, stitching warmth into a child's tunic, of the elder grinding roots into paste, whispering to the bones of the earth, of the girl learning to set a trap, of the mother, breathing slow, bringing forth life as the snow gathered outside. Let us remember the women of the ice, not as shadows, not as afterthoughts, but as the silent architects of survival. Before the leash, before collars with names, before the soft thud of paws on hardwood floors, there was only the sound of quiet breathing in the dark, a soft rustle, a shift in the fur near the fire, and a pair of eyes that did not belong to a human, but were no longer wild either. This was the beginning of friendship. We call them pets now, companions, family. But in the deep cold of the Ice Age, the first animals to curl beside us were something else. Neither beast nor burden. They were chosen, accepted, trusted, and they changed our story forever. It began with the wolf, not the sleek, domesticated dog who fetches sticks or waits by the door at dinner time. No, these were wild creatures, fierce, clever, driven by instinct. Their eyes glowed in the firelight, their breath steamed in the night air, but they watched us, they followed our trails, watched our hunts, smelled the bones we left behind. And we watched them too. At some point, some quiet point in the long gray centuries, a line was crossed. A wolf pup, perhaps abandoned or orphaned, was taken in, fed scraps, allowed to curl near the heat, not feared, not caged, but welcomed. It would have taken generations, not a single taming, but a slow dance of trust. Some wolves stayed wild, others grew bold, and some stayed close. They guarded, they hunted, they warmed our shelters with their bodies and our spirits with their presence. The archaeological evidence tells us this story in bones. A canine skeleton buried with care beside a human, dated more than 14,000 years ago, perhaps more. The bones show signs of age, of tenderness, of companionship. This animal had not merely lived with people, it had lived for them, and been loved. In other burials, we find dogs cradled like children. In some, they are given beads or tokens, offerings not of ownership, but of honor. What did these early dogs look like? Not quite wolf, not quite the spaniels or shepherds we know today. They were smaller, shaggier, their jaws less pronounced, their eyes softer. They had begun to change, not just physically, but in spirit. They no longer flinched at our presence. They looked toward us, and we looked back. These were not mere tools. They were companions. In the hunt, dogs helped drive game into traps. In the camp, they alerted humans to predators or strangers. In the night, they curled beside sleeping bodies, adding warmth, adding breath, adding comfort. Some were surely playful, licking hands, nosing at scraps, following children with wagging tails. Some may have been mourned when they passed, their names, if they had them, lost to time, but their place beside us, forever etched into the path of our survival. And it didn't end with dogs. There is some evidence, still debated, that humans may have kept foxes in certain regions, or tamed birds for feathers and company. Later, in warmer centuries, goats and sheep, cats and cattle would come, but it started with the wolf, the first creature to sit beside us and not run away, the first to trust, the first to belong. And what a quiet revolution it was, because in a world of danger, in a life of constant movement and uncertainty, that soft presence, the one waiting at the edge of the fire. Ears perked, eyes half closed, tail curled to its side, meant something. It meant safety. It meant connection. It meant we were not alone. Today, our dogs sleep in our beds. They ride in our cars. They wait at the door and leap into our arms. But their story began in the cold, in silence, in a shared breath beside a shared flame. They were not just the first pets. They were the first chosen family, and some part of them, some instinct, some bone memory, still remembers the snow, the cave, the hush of a human voice in the dark, saying simply, "Stay, you are safe here. You are one of us." Not everything that walked in the snow left footprints. Some things moved through dreams, through whispers in the dark, through the flicker of a flame on the cave wall, through the cry of the wind when no one was near. To us, the Ice Age was cold and hard, a world shaped by necessity, but to the people who lived it, it was alive with presence. It wasn't just survival. It was sacred. They lived close to death, closer than we can truly imagine. Every day was a balance between cold and warmth, hunger and sustenance, birth and loss. And when you live that close to the edge, you begin to sense that the world is not just made of things, but of spirits. The tree was not just a tree. It was an elder. The bison was not just meat. It was a gift, perhaps even an ancestor. The fire was not just warmth. It was a voice, breathing light into the dark. We don't know their gods by name. No stone tablets tell us what they believed, but we can see it in the symbols carved into bone, in the figures painted on cave walls, in the circles of stones arranged like altars. They left behind patterns, marks not meant for function, marks meant for meaning. Shamans may have been the bridge, not rulers, not warriors, but dreamers, listeners, those who could see between the world of breath and the world beyond it. They may have worn fur robes or antler headdresses. They may have carried pouches of herbs or bones. They may have sat in silence, eyes closed, beside the fire, while the storm screamed outside. And when a child was sick, or when the hunt had failed, or when someone died, they did not offer answers. They offered ritual, smoke rising, hands lifting, words spoken in a language older than speech. Some caves seemed to be sacred places, far from shelter, hard to reach, deep inside the earth, where echoes do strange things. There, the paintings take on another tone, not just animals, but hybrids, man-deer, woman-birds, antlered spirits, things not of this world. Were they visions, dreams, memories, or were they encounters? To live in the Ice Age was to live with mystery. You couldn't control the weather. You couldn't stop the illness. You couldn't explain the stars, but you could speak to them, through offering, through gesture, through faith. They may have believed that spirits lived in every rock, that ancestors walked as snowflakes, that the moon listened, that fire remembered, and maybe, just maybe, those beliefs kept them alive, not because they changed the world, but because they gave it meaning. They gave pain a purpose. They gave death a place. They gave hope, roots. Today, when we feel awe at a mountain, or whisper to the sky in grief, or close our eyes before we speak our heart, we are echoing them, the ones who knelt in snow and felt it speak back. They did not see death as an ending, not the way we often do. Clinical, cold, final. For the people of the Ice Age, death was not a vanishing. It was a crossing, a passage, a return. And the bones that remained behind were not forgotten. They were honored, arranged, painted, touched, because bones, to them, still held presence, still held personhood. In the frozen lands of the Ice Age, where the soil was often too hard to dig, burials were acts of immense labor and love. They weren't done casually. They weren't rushed. A body was carried, sometimes far, sometimes into the deepest part of a cave where no light reached, and then it was laid down, curled like sleep, often on its side, knees drawn in, as though preparing for rebirth. The graves tell us much. Some were sprinkled with red ochre, a powder of iron oxide, earthy and rich, resembling blood. Was it symbolic of life, a return to the womb of the earth, a protective dye for the journey into the next world? Others were accompanied by objects: a flint blade, a carved figurine, a string of beads, a shell that once held something fragrant or sacred. These were not random items. They were chosen, placed with care. A final gift, or perhaps tools for the journey ahead. Sometimes, multiple people were buried together. A woman and child, a group arranged in a circle, an elder buried with their dog. Some bones were painted, some rearranged years after death. Some even removed, kept in shrines, handled during rituals. It suggests something powerful, that the dead were not silent. They remained part of the living, not ghosts to fear, but voices to consult, presences to honor. The term bone dancers is a poetic one, but perhaps not entirely imagined. Some believe early humans may have used bones in ceremonies, rattles made from knuckle bones, drums stretched with skin, leg bones turned into flutes that whistled like wind, not as mockery, not as horror, but as reverence, as a way to say, even now, you speak. Certain burial sites suggest something more than grief. A man buried with flowers, pollen still found in the soil, millennia later. A young girl laid to rest with over 4,000 ivory beads sewn into her clothing. A labor that would have taken hundreds of hours. These weren't necessities. They were love, frozen into ritual. And some skeletons bear marks of ceremony. Skulls marked with symbols, bones arranged in patterns. A jawbone placed deliberately beneath the arm, long bones aligned with the stars. To us, it may seem strange, but to them, it was meaning. It was continuity, a way to remind the tribe. This person mattered. This life meant something. This soul goes on. Even now, when we visit graves, when we place flowers or run fingers along carved names, we echo these Ice Age rituals. The names are newer, the stones more polished, but the impulse is the same: to remember, to care, to hold on, even when the body is gone. In a world where so much could be lost, to weather, to hunger, to time, they still took the time to kneel, to gather, to bury, to believe. The bone dancers knew that memory could outlast the voice, that love could be carved into the earth, and perhaps that in honoring the dead, we teach the living how to carry one another. When the wind had quieted and the fire had burned low, when the last embers breathed their orange sighs against the cave wall, and frost began creeping once more across the stones outside, there was one thing left to keep the darkness at bay: a voice. Soft, measured, ancient, a story. In the Ice Age world, night was not something to rush through. It was long, it was heavy, and in winter, it stretched for what must have felt like forever. But in that darkness, something bloomed. Storytelling. Not the kind written down or read aloud, but something more intimate, passed from mouth to ear, from heart to breath. Tales were born by firelight, beneath the stars, tucked between sleep and waking, and once told, they lived. Imagine a small family huddled close inside a cave, children wrapped in furs, eyelids fluttering, a grandmother's voice rising like smoke. No paper, no books, just memory and imagination. She tells of a great elk with golden hooves that walked across the sky, carving rivers into the land with each step, of a girl who fell in love with the moon and became the first snowflake, of a boy who spoke to the wolves and was never seen again, but sometimes, when the wind howls, he answers. These were not just entertainment, they were instruction, maps of meaning, mirrors of wonder, stories taught where the reindeer traveled, which plants to avoid, what stars to follow in spring, what dreams meant, how the world was born, and how it might end. Children learned the names of the animals not just by pointing, but by hearing how the raven tricked the mammoth, how the bear stole fire from the gods, how the cave itself had once been a sleeping giant. Each tale was a thread in a great woven memory, passed not by ink, but by rhythm. Songs came too, low chants, rising and falling like breath, simple melodies repeated until they lived in the bones. Some to help babies sleep, some to mark the passing of the seasons. Some to be sung before the hunt, some to be hummed alone, quietly, while mending hides or stirring broth. There was no audience, no applause, only presence, and in the stillness of the long night, a song could feel like a promise that we are here, that we are together, that we will see morning. There's something timeless in this, because even now, when the power goes out, or the phone dies, or the night stretches too long, we tell stories, we light candles, we gather close, we hum, we remember. The fire might be smaller, the language different, but the need is the same, to understand, to belong, to make the dark less empty. And somewhere deep in your own memory, older than your name, older than the walls around you, there may still be a trace of that child curled beside the hearth, listening to a voice that speaks, not just of survival, but of wonder. There were no alphabets, no written sentences, no ink pressed to parchment, but still, they carved, they scratched, they marked, because even before there were books, there was the instinct to leave something behind, something that said, we were here, we saw this, we remembered, across the cold bones of Europe and Asia, in caves, on stones, and etched into bones. Archaeologists have found symbols, not full pictures, not stories and images like the cave murals we've come to admire, but marks, repeating marks, mysterious, quiet, deliberate, dots, lines, chevrons, crosshatches, patterns that seem to follow rules but which we can no longer read. Some appear beside animals, others stand alone. Some are carved into antler tools, others painted above torchlit caves. Were they calendars, spiritual notations, counting systems, lunar phases, names? We don't know, but we know this. They mattered because they were made carefully, repeated in different places, passed on. Imagine someone, perhaps a young woman, sitting at the cave wall, a sharpened bone in her hand, the firelight flickering behind her, the others asleep, and slowly, with patience, she scratches 7 dots into the wall, arranged in a curved arc. Beneath it, a line. Beside it, an X. She steps back, nods, says nothing. The next morning, no one erases it. No one questions it. It simply is. And weeks later, someone else adds to it. The temptation is to call it writing, to say these were the earliest forms of language. But perhaps they were something else, something softer, not meant to be spoken aloud, but felt. A code not of words, but of presence, of rhythm, of time. A way to mark when the herd would return, when the moon would rise full, when the cold would come back. A memory carved in stone, because memory carved into the mind might be lost. Some symbols are geometric, others seem to mimic the flow of wind, the path of rivers, the shape of antlers. Some are tiny and hidden, others take up entire walls. And the most haunting of all are the ones that repeat across thousands of miles, from caves in France, to cliffs in Siberia, to stones in northern Africa. The same marks, not exact copies, but familiar forms. Did they speak to one another across the ice? Did travelers carry these marks like passwords? Or were they born from the same human need, the need to make meaning? We scratch our initials into trees. We carve hearts into desks. We press fingerprints into wet concrete. And we don't always know why, but something inside us says, I was here. I saw this. I mattered. Perhaps the people of the Ice Age felt the same. Perhaps these marks weren't just records, but rituals, meditations, acts of grounding. In a world that changed with every wind, the stone stayed still, and if you could mark it, maybe part of you could stay still too. So now, as we walk through museums, past the etched bones behind glass, we stare. We tilt our heads. We try to decipher. But maybe these symbols aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they are meant to be felt, like a song in a language you don't know, but still moves you, like a name you can't pronounce, but somehow recognize, like a whisper from 1,000 generations ago, saying simply, "Look, feel, this mattered to me." They were not just animals. Not to them. The mammoth, the bear, the stag, the great feline with its silent step, these were not mere prey or obstacles or curiosities. They were symbols. They were spirits. They were sacred. To live in the Ice Age was to live among giants. Not mythical ones, but real ones. Towering beasts with tusks that could lift a tree. Predators whose breath could fog the air beside your own. Creatures that walked ancient paths long before the first human word was ever spoken. And yet humans watched them, followed them, hunted them, named them, and perhaps they worshipped them too. In caves across Europe and Asia, the walls are covered in images of animals. More animals than humans. More movement than stillness. Mammoths with curled tusks. Bison mid-charge. Horses galloping. Lions watching. These weren't drawn clumsily or carelessly. They were painted with precision, with understanding, as if the artist knew the creature, its muscles, its breath, its soul. And that suggests something deeper than admiration. It suggests reverence. The mammoth, especially, held power. It fed entire groups. Its bones became shelters. Its ivory became tools, art, offerings. To kill one was no small act. It required coordination, risk, sacrifice, and when it fell, its body was honored. Some mammoth bones are found arranged in circles, in patterns, skulls stacked, tusks set upright in the ground. Shrines, altars, memorials, we cannot say, but they speak of a relationship that went beyond hunger. And then there were the carvings, tiny figurines of animals, carried in pouches or worn around the neck. A bear carved into bone, a reindeer etched onto a pendant, a bird with wings outstretched. These weren't toys. They were totems, carried for protection, for luck, for guidance. Each animal had a meaning, a message, a medicine. To dream of a bear might signal strength. To see a fox might warn of deceit. To wear the image of a mammoth might invite endurance. And it wasn't just individual creatures. It was the spirit of the animal, what it represented. The bear was not just a bear. It was bareness itself, a force, a presence, a wisdom. The stag was not just a forest dweller. It was grace, speed, change. And the mammoth? The mammoth was memory, the old one, the keeper of paths. Some believe these creatures became clan identities. You weren't just a person. You were of the wolf, or of the aurochs, or of the bird. Children may have been named for the first animal seen after their birth, or marked with ochre patterns to reflect their totem's power. There may have been dances, masks, rituals. You became the animal in the ceremony, took on its posture, its cry, its purpose, not to dominate it, but to join it, to say, "We are one breath apart, one heartbeat away." And in death, this bond may have continued. Burials with animal bones, feathers, teeth laid beside the hand, symbols carved into grave goods, a quiet farewell, or a return to the greater circle, because perhaps they believed that when we died, we did not vanish. We became something, or someone else. The mammoth, the bird, the sky. Even today, something stirs in us when we see the wild up close. The way a deer freezes and looks back, the sound of a wolf's howl in the distance, the steady movement of an elephant, its great heart, slow and ancient. Something in us remembers. Not fear, not superiority, but awe, a sense that life is not a ladder, but a circle. And in that circle, we are not alone. They dreamed. Even in the deep cold, Even beneath layers of fur and ash and silence, as snow whispered against the shelter walls and the fire dimmed to coals, they closed their eyes and dreamed, not just of what was, but of what could be. What wasn't seen, but still felt. Because even when survival was the day's labor, the night belonged to something else. To visions, to mysteries, to the other world just beyond the skin of sleep. Dreams were not distractions. They were messages, signs, stories carried by breath into the morning. And in the world of the Ice Age, where nothing was certain and every shadow might be a spirit, dreams had power. They guided, they warned, they healed. Some dreams came soft, like the echo of a remembered scent. Others came loud, like a herd thundering through the mind. And some came with shapes and words and symbols, so strange, they demanded to be painted, etched, whispered into the ears of the tribe before the sun had risen. Shamans, perhaps, were the great dreamers. They learned to enter those deep places deliberately, through rhythm, chanting, fasting, smoke. They may have used herbs that dulled the senses and opened the inner eye. They may have entered trances, swaying by firelight, following drum beats into a place beyond time. And what they brought back was meaning. The spirit of the mammoth, the guidance of an ancestor. A cure, a path, a warning carved in metaphor. We cannot know their dreams, but we see their traces. In the hybrid creatures painted on cave walls, half human, half beast, in the eyes carved too large, too deep, as though filled with visions, in the careful placement of bones around sleeping bodies, as if to guard the dreamer on their journey. Perhaps they believed the soul left the body each night, and wandered, and needed help to return. Perhaps dreams were a kind of travel, to meet the dead, to ask the animals for permission, to seek counsel from the sky. Even ordinary people, not just shamans, dreamed of lost loved ones, of hunts that succeeded, of a fire that would never go out. They may have dreamed of warmth, of color, of a world without snow, or of the great white bear who spoke only in riddles, or of walking upside down along the ceiling of the world. And when they awoke, they carried the dream like a stone in the pocket of their thoughts. Heavy, important, sacred, dreams connected them to each other, to something beyond. When words were not enough, a dream could say what the heart could not. It could bring hope, or fear, or transformation. It could mark a child as special. It could tell a hunter to wait. It could teach someone how to make a tool never seen before. We still dream. We forget them, yes, but they visit us, just the same. And sometimes, when we dream of falling, or flying, or walking through a landscape that makes no sense, and yet feels like home, perhaps we are touching something older, a memory passed not through language, but through spirit, through the whisper of blood, through the rhythm of breath, through dreams beneath the ice. The snow didn't vanish in a day. The ice did not crack like glass all at once. It was not a grand melting, but a long, slow breath. Somewhere, one spring stayed unfrozen just a little longer. Somewhere else, grass returned a few weeks earlier. And somewhere, a child born beneath a sky still heavy with cloud would live to see trees that had not grown for centuries. The world was beginning to change, the last glacial maximum. The coldest, most expansive stage of the Ice Age reached its peak around 20,000 years ago. But slowly, over thousands of years, Earth began to shift. Not because of fire, not because of people, but because of the stars. Earth's orbit, tilted and tugged by subtle forces, shifted just enough to change the sunlight. More warmth began to touch the poles. The great glaciers, those frozen beasts that had crawled down from the north, began to retreat. At first, barely. A few meters a year. Then, entire miles. Then, entire landscapes unwrapped themselves like gifts beneath the melting sky. Rivers returned. Valleys emerged. Plants spread with abandon, like forgotten dreams rediscovering the soil. Where there had been only white and wind, There was now green, buzzing, life. Animals moved differently. New ones came. Wild boars, red deer, eventually cattle and sheep. The mammoth's great territories shrank. The saber-toothed cat lost its edge. And humans? Humans watched and adapted again. They were good at that, at noticing, at changing. They moved with the forests, followed new herds, abandoned caves that had once been home, and made new camps near lakes where none had existed before. Their clothing changed, lighter, looser. Their shelters, different shapes. Their tools, refined, narrowed, adjusted for new prey and new terrain. The earth was not done testing them, but now it tested them in new ways. Because while the cold could kill, it was familiar. Now, the world was in flux. Some regions became wetlands, too soft for fires, too unpredictable. Other regions dried out. Old trails vanished. New dangers appeared: floods, heat, competition. But humans moved forward, not in panic, in patience. They watched the birds. They tasted new leaves. They carved new symbols on stones that hadn't seen light in 10,000 years. And slowly, they emerged from the ice. Imagine what it must have felt like to see a tree grow where only frost had ever been, to hear frogs croak at dusk, to watch rain fall that wasn't snow, to smell earth again. It must have been terrifying. It must have been glorious, and it must have stirred something ancient and tender. The sense that the world was not ending, but beginning again. And perhaps, beneath all their wonder, they knew they had survived the cold. They would survive the change, not by resisting it, but by listening, by adapting, by remembering. That is what humans do best. The cold had ruled for so long that when the water finally came, few were prepared. It didn't come as a gentle trickle or a soft summer storm. It came in surges, in silence broken by the sound of land tearing, in walls of water that remembered every glacier and moved as if reclaiming what once was frozen. The world was warming, and now the waters were rising. For thousands of years, water had been locked away, stored in vast glaciers and polar caps, frozen into the bones of mountains, curled into the hollows of valleys. But as the earth tilted and trembled, and the sun reached farther north with each season, that water was set free. Glaciers cracked, ice sheets collapsed. And slowly, then suddenly, seas began to rise. Coastlines changed like dreams. What was once solid ground became soft, then marsh, then sea. Lowlands vanished. Rivers shifted course. Entire regions disappeared beneath salt water. Places where families had camped for generations, gone. Fields once hunted, now filled with fish and silence. Doggerland, a word we give now to a world that vanished. Once, it connected Britain to Europe, a vast, flat plain of grasslands, rivers, forests. Humans lived there, walked with their dogs, followed reindeer, buried their dead, and then, one flood at a time, the sea returned. By 8,000 years ago, Doggerland was gone, swallowed by the North Sea, and its memory perhaps survived only in stories, of land that fell into the waves, of spirits that walked on water, of warnings whispered around the fire, about building too close to the shore. Across the world, similar stories linger. In South America, in Africa, in Asia, tales of floods appear again and again, not always identical, but always present. A deluge, a drowning, a world washed clean. Mythologists once thought it coincidence, but now, some wonder, did our ancestors carry the memory of real floods, encoded in story? Did the loss of ancient homelands become the seeds of the great flood myths that still echo today? Atlantis, the boat on the mountain. Perhaps they weren't fantasy, but remembrance of when the earth melted, and the sea rose, and everything changed. For the people of the Ice Age, the floods were not just dramatic, they were devastating. Freshwater lakes, burst through ice dams, flooding entire valleys in hours. Walls of water carved new landscapes. The Black Sea may have once been a freshwater basin, until the Mediterranean spilled into it, changing lives forever. Some people drowned, others ran, some climbed to higher ground and watched the world below vanish, and some remembered, not just with tears, but with story, with carving, with caution passed through generations. The water gave too. It brought fish, transport, connection, new coastlines full of shellfish and seabirds. But first, it took. It reminded humanity that the earth is never still, that land is not permanent, that nothing is guaranteed. And yet, humans stayed. They built rafts. They found new shores. They followed the tides and named them friend. They did not fight the sea. They learned to listen to it. And perhaps that is why we still dream of floods, why water appears in our myths, our fears, our cleansing rituals. Because once, long ago, when the earth began to weep its frozen tears, we were there. We watched the waves return, and we did not sink. We remembered. Some goodbyes are not spoken. They happen in silence. In the stillness of an empty valley, in the absence of tracks, where tracks once were. Some disappearances are not noticed all at once. Only later, when the songs no longer mention the creature, when the hunt returns with nothing, when the bones grow old and no new ones take their place. The warming world gave birth to rivers, trees, and meadows, but it also took things away, and some were never seen again. As the glaciers retreated, and the earth thawed, and the air grew warm and wet, a great quieting began. Across the continents, creatures that had once ruled the Ice Age vanished. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, glyptodons, armored beasts like walking boulders, and towering elk with antlers wider than the reach of men. They did not disappear in a single moment, but in a long exhale. One fewer birth each year, one harder winter, one too many hunts, until only their memory remained. The reasons were many. Climate shifted, habitats changed, new plants took over, old ones faded. Some animals were specialists, made perfectly for a world of snow and cold, and when that world changed, they could not follow. Others may have been hunted into memory. Humans had grown more skilled, their weapons sharper, their groups larger, their hunger constant, and perhaps they did not know they were saying goodbye. What would it have felt like to see the last mammoth, to spot it on the horizon, alone, majestic and doomed? Did someone follow it for days? Did they hesitate before drawing the spear? Did a child point and ask, "Why are there no more?" Perhaps the last of them did not die in violence, but in silence, collapsing on tundra that no longer fed it, under skies that had grown too warm, and somewhere, someone remembered. We know they mourned. In caves, mammoths are painted not only as prey, but as giants, framed with reverence. In some places, bones were stacked, arranged, honored, perhaps to remember, perhaps to beg forgiveness. A predator understands the value of balance, and when balance tips, so too does the world. Not every animal vanished, but many changed. Some grew smaller, others wandered to different lands, some learned to fear the presence of humans, and humans, in turn, had to adapt. The world of mammoths was ending. Now came deer, elk, boar, faster, clever, harder to track, less yielding. Hunting changed, and so did humans, but the echoes remained. Stories told by firelight of animals taller than trees, with tusks that held the sky. Carvings made long after the last sighting, as if trying to keep them alive in memory, if not in body. And in the bones, buried beneath millennia of earth, we find grief, the quiet kind, the kind that leaves space, that says, something was here, and now it is not. We don't often think of our ancestors as mourners, But how could they not be? They lived beside these creatures, chased them, feared them, warmed themselves in their hides, named them in stories, sang of them in winter, and then they said goodbye. Not with tombstones, not with elegies, but with silence, with stone carvings, with a different path through the forest. Extinction is not only about biology, it is about memory, and memory lives long in the human soul. So when we speak of the Ice Age, let us not speak only of the cold, let us speak also of the warmth we felt, even for the things we could not save. The mammoth was gone. The herds moved differently now. The forest crept back over old trails, and the snow no longer lingered the way it once did. And with this new earth came new hunger. Not for meat alone, but for something different, something gentler, something that stayed in place. It began with seeds, tiny, fragile, ordinary, but world-changing. For tens of thousands of years, humans had followed the food, hunting, gathering, moving, a life built around the rhythm of animals and the whisper of wild plants. But as the climate softened, and the ice retreated, and the land grew fertile, humans began to notice something. Some plants returned where they had been dropped. Grains grew along the riverbanks, nuts could be stored, and the land, once unpredictable and cold, could be coaxed. It could be tended, encouraged, trusted. And so, for the first time, people stayed. It did not happen overnight. Domestication took centuries, but it began simply by gathering seeds and returning to them, by noticing which grew best, by favoring the ones that didn't shatter or scatter. Barley, wheat, lentils, peas, first wild, then patient, then cultivated. People cleared land, watched the sky, learned the moods of soil and season, and slowly, the first gardens were born. With this shift, life changed. Homes became more permanent, shelters more elaborate, tools more refined, pestles and mortars, grinding stones, clay vessels for storage, and baskets woven tightly enough to hold grain. Food was now something to plan, not chase. It could be stored, traded, shared over time. And with that came a new kind of freedom. Not freedom of movement, but freedom of imagination. Because when food was secured, time opened, time to decorate, to build, to dream bigger. Settlements formed, families grew. Ideas traveled not just by footsteps, but by trade, and new relationships formed. Not just with animals, but with the land itself. Some still hunted, some still wandered. But more and more, people began to root, to trust the earth beneath their feet, to believe that the ground would give again, if cared for. And in return, they gave it names, rituals, songs. They thanked the rains, they prayed for good harvest, they remembered the old way, but stepped carefully into the new. And it wasn't just plants. Animals changed too. Wild sheep became sheep that stayed. Goats learned to follow. Dogs grew smaller, softer, more helpful. Pigs were coaxed from the forest. The relationship shifted, no longer predator and prey, but caretaker and kin. Some were raised for milk, others for meat, some for labor, warmth, companionship. And once again, humans adapted, not by force, but by listening. To rhythm, to season, to what the world was offering now. And even though the world no longer roared with cold, the memory of the ice remained, in the stories, in the caution, in the deep respect for survival. They had endured the age of snow, and now they were learning to live in the age of seed, with fire in their hearths, and food in their baskets, and a new kind of future growing quietly beneath their feet. When the earth softened, and the rivers flowed longer, and the grain grew tall, where once only wind had lived, humans did something they had never fully done before. They stayed. They set down baskets. They shaped clay. They marked the land with footsteps that would not be erased by morning. The first villages were born. Not large, not loud, but real, permanent. The world had changed, And with it, the spirit of humanity shifted too. In the Ice Age, movement had been life. To stay too long was to starve. But now, food came from the ground. Water flowed nearby. The game returned with the seasons, and so the shelters grew sturdier. Walls from mud brick or packed earth, roofs layered with straw or woven reed, circles turned into squares, tents became homes. There was space to store, to raise animals, to sit outside and watch a plant grow. It was new, and it changed everything. With stillness came structure. Who guarded the grain? Who decided when to plant? Who watched the sky and read the rain? Roles formed. Some taught, some healed, some crafted tools, some shaped the world of belief, because even as the glaciers melted and the air turned warm, humans still looked beyond. They had survived the cold with spirits. Now they needed gods for the harvest, for the hearth, for the home. And so the gods changed. They became softer, not gone, but closer, not just of wind and beast, but of soil and seed. Fertility figures multiplied, curved forms with wide hips, full bellies, round breasts, icons of abundance, of life that returns, of fields that ripen, and children who thrive, some carved from stone, others molded from clay, placed in homes, buried in fields, held in hand during childbirth or prayer. These weren't gods of conquest. They were gods of continuance, of water that flows, of bread that rises, of wombs and weather. Villages became sacred places. Altars built from stone and memory, fire pits arranged with symmetry, burials beneath floors, grandmothers resting beneath the places where grandchildren would walk. Time folded in on itself. The dead weren't gone. They were part of the home. And above each door, perhaps, a symbol, a marking, a name spoken in silence before stepping inside. With roots in the earth came roots in identity. This land was ours. This stream, blessed. That hill, for the spirits. Territory was no longer just where the herd wandered. It was a place of return. Maps formed, etched not on parchment, but in hearts. In ritual, in memory. Festivals marked planting and harvest. Songs welcomed the moon's return. The stars were no longer just for navigation. They were calendars, prophecies, eyes of the gods. And as the world grew warmer, humanity grew more layered. More belongings, more tools, more time to wonder, to worry, to hope. And with that, belief deepened. Not because life was harder, but because it was worth something now. There was more to protect, more to love, more to pray for. New gods walked beside old spirits. The mammoth still lingered in stories, but now there was also the god of the grain, the mother beneath the mountain, the child born in spring and buried in autumn. Myth grew, wrapped around fire and field alike, and all of it, every whispered prayer, every carved figure, every drumbeat on festival nights, was a testament not just to what humans believed, but to what they hoped, that life would continue, that warmth would remain, that what they planted would grow. When a person stays in one place long enough, they begin to leave marks, marks on the ground, on the trees, on the faces of their children, on the bones buried beneath their feet, but also on the stones. And in the warming world that rose after the Ice Age, humans began to carve not just tools, but memories. At first, the marks were small, symbols etched on walls, simple lines, repetitions, a spiral, a handprint, a sun, a creature once hunted but now only remembered. These were not for utility. They were not to cut or dig or hunt. They were to say something, to speak without voice, to leave behind meaning for those not yet born. Some stones stood alone, upright, weathered, mysterious, placed with care in fields where no road yet led. Others formed circles, rows, crescents aligned with the stars, or the solstice, or the return of the rains. We do not always know what they meant, but we know they meant something, because someone placed them, someone shaped them, someone stopped and looked and said, "This is where it belongs." And others returned to see it again. In some places, bones were buried in stone chambers, the dead laid in fetal pose, surrounded by beads, tools, a bowl of grain. Perhaps they believed life would begin again, just as spring did, just as the earth had. They marked graves with carvings, faces shaped into the rock, animals etched beside them, symbols of continuity, a belief that memory could outlast breath. And in time, stories became monuments, not tall, not grand, but lasting. A line of stones, marking a path once taken, a cave painting refreshed year after year by generations, a polished bead passed through 5 lifetimes, a figurine found miles from its origin, traded with care, held with reverence. And so history was not written in books. It was pressed into the skin of the world. Even language began to shift, not just sounds, but markings. The first attempts to capture meaning outside the body, tally marks for seasons, symbols for herds, signs that a thing had happened and should not be forgotten. Memory was now external, carried in more than mind, carried in stone. And with this, humans became chroniclers, not of just what was, but of what ought to be remembered. That there was a time before warmth, that people survived it, that there had been beasts the size of dreams, and that people hunted them, and honored them, and watched them go, that the world once froze, and thawed, and bloomed again, and humans had endured it all. So when we touch these stones today, when we see the carvings, the circles, the caves, we are not simply looking at art, we are reading whispers, we are holding echoes, we are being handed the memory of survival, not triumph, not conquest, but endurance. A record that says, we were here, we stayed, we remembered. We often speak of survival as something loud, as struggle, as triumph shouted from mountaintops, as the clash of teeth and fire. But if the story of the Ice Age has taught us anything, it is that survival is often quiet. A mother's hand passing warmth to her child, a figure moving through snow, not for glory, but simply to return home. A seed planted not for the self, but for a season yet to come. We survived not because we were the strongest, not because we mastered everything, but because we adapted, because we listened, because we remembered. Beneath the roaring glaciers, beneath the storms and starvation and extinction, humanity held on to something small, a thread, delicate, frayed, but unbroken. That thread was not a spear or a fire. It was kindness, curiosity, a carved mammoth bone given to a child, a song shared in a shelter dug into the earth, a story told over and over until it outlasted the cold itself. And now, we are the living memory of all those who came before. We are the warmth they dreamed of, the future they couldn't name, but believed in anyway. When they gathered around a fire, when they painted on cave walls, when they buried their dead with beads and stone, they were writing us into existence. They didn't know our names, but they believed we were worth surviving for. And maybe the story isn't just that we survived the Ice Age. It's that we became something more because of it. We learned to care, to share, to shape the world with thought as well as tool. We became artists and gardeners and keepers of memory. We became human. Tonight, as you settle under your blankets, safe, warm and still, remember that long ago, someone braved the bitter wind so that one day, someone else could rest. That someone lit a fire in a cave and passed along the spark. That someone watched the stars and dreamed of spring long before they knew if it would come. And it did. We are made from ice and bone and hope, from soil and song and silence. We are the children of the cold, but also the architects of warmth. And if they could survive that world, the teeth of winter, the empty bellies, the fading herds, then perhaps we too, in our strange modern troubles, can endure what feels unbearable, because we carry that same thread, the same quiet strength, the same gentle courage. So close your eyes now. Let the ice melt. Let the fires burn low. Let the mammoths dream beneath the soil. Let the spirits of the old world sigh into the wind. You are part of a story, older than words, and softer than stone, and deeper than any cold could reach. Good night, wanderer. Rest well. You've traveled far to be here, and you are not alone.